Great, Pablo. Yeah, thank you, Pablo, for all your work and efforts on this workshop. I think you put a lot of time thinking, and I'm enjoying it very much. Yeah, and thank you for all our interactions. I think that is part of this presentation that I'm trying to do it mostly some exercise for maybe thinking a little bit about these systems and for mostly developing ideas and yeah, trying to make these slides, trying to put it from the beginning. From a project that we are developing, and we got some seed funds to start developing these ideas. We've been thinking and interacting with, well, Javier as well, with Pablo and several other people, and as well as with producers. And so I want to put forward some of the ideas that are more open questions than answers, but hopefully we can stimulate some discussion. So the problem that actually pushed this idea forward is, for this particular talk, is the idea that cows live in this sea of grass that without any diversity, and even worse, when they live, this is the scablands of Eastern Washington, where they have a massive invasion of this exotic weed, Medusa head, which we are in the same system, animals grazing a sea of monotonous grass. And we know that the quality of that grass plummets in the midsummer, and it's even worse, right, for weeds, because that window of quality is much shorter. And that causes all these negative impacts on from economics, that the producer has to essentially put some money into supplementation, reductions in production, emissions, and reductions in biodiversity in general. You see that how birds or insects can inhabit these landscapes. But we know that cattle evolve in these diverse systems, like this cartoon and information we have from their development on Earth. And then we know that they ate all this diversity of grasses and forbs, broadleaves, shrubs, and we are basically having these animals in a sea of grass. And we know that even animals that are exposed to monotonous rations, their taste system basically stops responding to those autosensorial dimensions, and that causes aversion and stress and increases in cortisol. We have data even showing that animals exposed to a diversity, like this in sheep, of ingredients versus monotony, where the animals have just one ration, the levels of cortisol are higher. And we have more about this when Javier is putting his presentation. So that's, I leave it at that. That's from the autosensorial experiences. And even this is a study where lambs were offered monotonous rations with just one flavor, bitter, sweet, umami, or without any added flavors, or when the animals had a choice of all these different flavors in the same ration. We see that the feeding pattern is different. They show less peaks and valleys at the top, at the peaks of intake. And that more even distribution of the feeding pattern leads to a much more efficient use of nutrients. And they actually tend to gain even more weight, even under the same ration with different flavors. And that effect is amplified when we are dealing with multiple plants with different chemicals, because we are aiming at this, what we learn in Animal Nutrition 101, those associative effects. And that's where we're aiming, for instance, in that particular example, like the protein and non-structural carbohydrates. And that synchrony leads to a much more efficient use of nutrients and a much greater digestibility. And we have data on cows when they have choices among legumes like alfalfa versus trefoil or sainfoin, or all the possible combinations and even monocultures. We see that their gains is enhanced with a three-way combination when they have choices. So another benefit of this diversity as opposed to monotony is the diversity of chemicals, particularly primary nutrients, that lead to also complementarities. And we are focusing mostly in soluble fibers, these chemicals that are a little bit ignored by the literature, where we are seeing that these soluble fiber in forbs and legumes have significant impacts on the kinetics of rumen fermentation, improve the synchrony of energy and protein use, and then, of course, with positive effects on production and reductions in environmental impacts. And even another benefit of diversity is these plant secondary compounds that are, of course, defensive. Some of them evolve against herbivory, herbivory or pests. But then we know that at appropriate doses, they have these medicinal effects from antiparasitic, antibacterial, antioxidants, reductions in environmental impacts that we are seeing in these systems, as well as improvements in meat and milk quality. So we have all these benefits that we are denying animals because of their monotony. And that's some examples showing there, like just comparing, legumes like Caesar milvet, which is a legume which has those soluble fibers, or versus trefoil with condensed tannins. Emissions, the methane production per unit of intake is way lower than in grass. Even this grass, which is even in prime quality, like meadow brome grass, the emissions are way lower. And if we look at the graph on the right, tannin-containing legumes like sainfoin or trefoil, we see a much lower level of urinary expression relative to alfalfa, for instance. And then because, as we saw in the talk by Glenn, that there's a shift in the nitrogen fade from the urine to feces, so you get a much more efficient utilization of the protein resource and also more retention. But what's more interesting in this study is that we found synergisms among tannins. So animals that had a combination of tannins from trefoil and tannins from sainfoin, we have a much greater reduction in urinary nitrogen than animals fed just the legumes with the tannins by themselves. So we see that the synergisms apply not only on nutrients, but also on secondary compounds. And I think way more research is needed in that topic because there's a potential of way more room for reducing environmental impacts. So then the question is, well, how then we break this monotony? And then the answer that we came across from this reasoning is that why not develop these islands of diversity in the sea of grass? So develop these diverse chemoscapes in the landscape where we have this diversity of chemicals from soluble fibers to non-structural carbohydrates to secondary compounds that may allow a much better nutrition of the animal, but not only that, but also improvements in ecosystem services, as we'll see. The concept of islands is relatively new, but it's been applied mostly on niche ecosystems, some grassland ecosystems, where this propagule of restoration island is essentially dispersing outwards across the landscape where we get recovery. Not much in terms of, we're not looking at chemicals in these approaches, but at least we see this idea of island develop in the literature. In dryland ecosystems is way less applied because of all the constraints of biotic and abiotic factors in rangelands. So the dispersal is way less likely, but still, these self-sustaining islands that can be established in landscapes can restore many of ecosystem functions in rangelands from providing cover to connectivity, habitat for wild habitats for wild species, insects, and refugia, as well as corridors in the landscape. And that's the potential multi-functions of these islands, some related to what we saw in the previous talk on urinary nitrogen excretion, because, for instance, condensed tannins reduce the fate of urinary nitrogen. So we get increasing body condition scores, winning weights, pregnancy rates, all these parameters that producers are so concerned about by provision of these nutraceuticals and nutrients, improving animal health and welfare because we are providing diversity. We are also affecting animal distribution, the fecal nitrogen, as we saw in the previous talk, and also habitat for wild species and insects. But how we implement this, so that's, I think the idea was developed as we discussed with Pablo many times, but how we implement this. So the implementation, we are starting as we speak on testing some of these different species of forbs and legumes in garden studies where we are basically looking at potential for establishing and persistent in rangelands. So this may be more case-by-case study type of studies where we are looking at specific persistent and establishment of these species depending on the ecosites where we want to establish these islands. Then we are then moving into the chemistry of this, and then we're borrowing ideas from drug testing and discovery. So the idea is, why don't we test this in silico? So first trying to aim for these complementarities, as I was mentioning before, but in this case, looking at these complementarities from rangelands, so the base diet that the animals have with these islands. And then we are working with Pablo on this, on mainly trying to look at modeling for these potential synergies that then we can test in vitro. So we are building this system from in silico to in vitro to a small scale, then to large scale. So that's the idea, moving from the lab to the land. So then the next point that we need to consider is arrangement of those species in the islands. We can go from an aggregated distribution, from interseeding those different species to patches or discrete patches, the example that we on the right, so that discrete patches, we have benefits for both, right? So when we are interseeding, some mixtures will provide or allow for the expression of niche differentiation and also plant-plant interactions that may be positive, but in many cases they may be negative. So we may see more competition than facilitation. So why don't we look at patches where we see that we are not having to deal with these problems of agronomic competitions that we have between species. And also we know that animals in patches are more efficient at harvesting and handling those species because once they sit or their feeding station is a patch, then they don't lose time in handling or searching. So potentially patchy islands will be the ideal, but that's open also for discussion. Also it's open for discussion looking at, well, do we want to continue with natives? Are we introducing functional exotics? What is the benefit that we have? Positives and negatives depending on agencies, producers, and so on. Spatial arrangement, so how we distribute those, deploy those islands in the landscape, given those constraints of the rangeland, right? So biotic and abiotic factors. And in that case, we have the help of GIS people that are helping us, for instance, look at digital elevation data and also GIS imagery, where we can go back in time and then see spots in the landscape that are greener than the average green that we see in the landscape through the years, even from the 80s to now, and then select those spots like indicated in these orange areas there where greenness, the index of green is greater than the average. So we can select potentially that complexity, trying to bring those areas that we have higher likelihood of success for the islands. Then we need to look at scale, animal factors. We need those islands to be multifunctional so that they function not only for cows, but also for wild species and even for pollinators. So we need to provide these islands being shared resource as opposed to just resource for cows. So how many islands, how big, because we are aiming for the coexistence of species. So, and then we know from the literature that fractal landscapes, as I call it, like broken geometry, right? Like we saw here in the left, is where fractal landscapes allow a greater packaging of species in the landscape, as opposed to Euclidean, or as I call it, more agronomic distributions, where we have patches or islands in perfect squares or shapes, where essentially the packaging of species is going to be lower. So, and if we go back to the then coarse grain foragers like a cow, for instance, can basically travel through space and utilize those islands, whereas smaller individuals, like from even small mammals to even insects, may focus or attack, focalize small spots in the landscape. So, and then if we go back to that GIS map I showed you before, where we have, depending on the elevation of the landscape and also on the wet spots where water tends to go, for instance, we have that fractal distribution of that. So that is, in a way, that fractal distribution of elevations and water resources are, in a way, helping us probably devise islands in the landscape, or deploy islands in the landscape that are already by nature distributed in a fractal dimension. Animal factors, we know also that if we go too small in the island, then cows particularly start losing selectivity. We have some evidence that like Laca show in the 2010 that cows start to become less selective as the size of the island becomes, or a radius with, a circle with a radius of basically the size of the cow. So we need definitely islands for greater than 10 square meters. And we also know by results we have with elk that when they are supplemented in an area, the vegetation that they impact away from that node of supplementation is about 100 meters. So essentially, we know that, for instance, an island may impact an herbivore in a way that it can utilize the vegetation around that focus with 100 meters radius. So that information at least helps us to set some parameters in terms of dimensions for the islands and also distribution of the islands in the landscape. And then, as I was mentioning before, the inspiration for this came not only from discussions with Pablo and other scientists, but also with producers, that they are already doing this in the scablands of Eastern Washington, as I was showing you before with that Medusa head, this invasive weed. They are tending to gain essentially carrying capacity by just creating this seeding and then creating these improvements or improved pastures, and then animals graze in those improved pastures, and then they rotate to the Medusa head infested land, where they disturb, they clean the weed, they trample, and then they prepare the seedbed for more islands to be seeded. So that idea of that's a virtuous cycle where essentially they are creating 5 to 10 year plants where they graze, then they seed, then the next year they have a greater area to seed, or even in a different area. So they're moving around that virtuous cycle of grazing and restoration. The same we are developing in Chile, Punta Arenas, where we have sheep grazing or browsing this shrub, Chilotrichum diffusum, where the animals get supplemented. They create these islands or these areas where they heavily browse on a targeted grazing program. So then that targeted grazing area is giving competitive advantage to the herbs and grasses that live under those shrubs, creating those spotty islands in the landscape, and potentially in the future trying to bring bringing seed. So that's the next plan, the plan that it comes after this is just, instead of just relying on the seed bank, moving forward into seeding those areas where the sheep browse. And then even in pasture lands, people are taking these ideas. We are working with Cercanates in Oregon State, trying to create also islands in pasture lands for dairy cows, where some to the perennial pastures at this producer. This is an article that came recently where this producer is taking this approach and providing forage. Is saying that that forage is more than just grass. It can be medicine for his cows. So basically creating these diverse herb pastures in conjunction with their traditional pastures, where they can provide their animals secondary compounds that improve their health of their animals, their welfare, reductions in environmental impacts, and also enhancing health in his herd. So Cercan is also moving forward in this with producers in this area to get this word out. So I think that we need a lot of fine tuning in developing these smart foodscapes, from issues, as I was mentioning, from scale to space. I call it concentration of islands in the landscape, how we go about with concentrating these islands, how many islands per acre, how many islands per hectare, the size of the islands. I touch a little bit on that, so such that it can be a shared resource as opposed to a resource for just cows. Also issues of grazing management that I don't have the time to mention here, but we can use, of course, fences, riders, fire, many different approaches that we can utilize to manage how we rotate these animals through the landscape. Issues of doses as in terms of the secondary compounds and in terms of the nutrients, that's another question that we can discuss. But also, of course, comes with economics. Producers are asking, well, how often I need to reseed these islands if those species don't persist. So there's issues of economics. Some people say, well, even if you have to reseed every 2 years or 3 years, it still may be economically feasible. Thus, increasing the concentration of islands in the landscape reduces increases the persistence of the islands, meaning that I dilute the grazing pressure, as people do here with a tree that is called aspen. They try to saturate the herbivore by creating multiple regeneration areas. So where then they dilute the herbivory pressure from wild species. So can we do the same with these islands in the landscape? And of course, we are working with people into science, technology, education, and arts to create an education program where we can train these ideas, not only move these ideas forward to producers, but also we are trying to engage people from even students from elementary school all the way through high school, from the development of gardens, such that we can educate our current and future land stewards. So that's in a nutshell where we have this program, and hopefully we can get more discussion about all these topics. Yeah, thank you for your attention.